The parking garage under the Aurelian Hotel smelled of rain and gasoline, and Amara Chukwu was counting exits the way other people counted breaths. 3 of them. 2 men blocking the ramp, one leaning against a black SUV with his arms crossed, enjoying himself. Between them, an old man in a threadbare army coat pressed a canvas bag to his chest like it held his heartbeat instead of insulin and a week of blister pack pills. "Last time," the man by the SUV said, in Korean too fast for a tourist to follow. Amara wasn't a tourist. 6 years in Seoul had given her the language and, more usefully, the specific cadence men used right before they stopped asking. "Give us the bag, grandfather, and we forget your face." "It's medicine," the old man said. "It's not worth anything to you." "Everything's worth something to somebody." Amara stepped out from behind the concrete pillar where she'd been standing for the last 90 seconds, deciding. "It's worth his life," she said, "which is more than you're going to be worth in about 10 seconds if you don't get back in your very shiny, very rented car." 3 heads turned. She watched them do the math. A woman, on her own, dressed for a double shift and not a fight, and decided she was worth a laugh before she was worth a weapon. That was always the mistake. "Sweetheart," the one by the SUV said, and she cataloged that word too, filed it next to all the others men used when they wanted you smaller than you were. "Walk away." "I did the math already," she said. "You're 26, maybe 27. You've been doing this, what? Debt collection, protection, whatever euphemism your boss uses, for 3 years tops, because you still enjoy it, and men who've done it longer stop enjoying it. That means you haven't been hit by someone who knew how yet." He blinked. It was such a small thing, that blink, but it was the last calm second he had. He shoved her. She let the shove carry her half a step back, enough to load her weight into her heel, then caught his wrist on the way past her ribs, turned into him instead of away, and used his own momentum to fold his arm somewhere it wasn't built to fold. He hit the wet concrete like a dropped coat. The sound he made was small and surprised, the sound of a man discovering a fact about the world he should already have known. The other 2 didn't move. She hadn't expected them to. Fear was a kind of physics. It had its own weight, its own gravity, and she just demonstrated both. "I warned you," she said to no one in particular, and helped the old man gather the bag that had spilled across the ground, tucking a loose blister pack back inside with more gentleness than she'd shown anyone in the last 4 minutes. 30 meters away, inside an armored car with windows the color of unlit rooms, Kang Do-yun watched all of it happen through glass thick enough to stop a rifle round and felt something move in his chest that hadn't moved in a long time. His head of security had a hand halfway to his radio, waiting for a word that would send 2 more men down into that garage to finish what the woman had started, or to make sure it never got finished at all. Do-yun didn't give it. He held up one finger, wait, the way he might hold up a hand to stop a clock, and watched a stranger in a secondhand jacket refuse to be smaller than 3 men wanted her to be. She wasn't beautiful in the way the city sold beauty, all glass and symmetry and camera angles. She was beautiful the way a closed fist was beautiful, or a decision. Her braids were pulled back and starting to come loose at the temple. Her jeans were soaked through at the knee where she must have crouched to help the old man. And when she straightened and looked directly at the tinted window of his car, not knowing who was behind it, not caring, something in Do-yun's ribs turned over like a key finding its lock. He hadn't smiled in front of his own men in 4 years. He caught himself doing it now, and none of them said a word. "Sir," his driver said carefully, "do you want... find out who she is?" Do-yun said, quietly. He did not say the other thing he was thinking, which was that for 6 seconds, watching a stranger drop a grown man onto wet concrete, he had felt something other than the low gray static that had filled the space where his heart used to sit. He filed that feeling away the way he filed everything dangerous. Carefully, silently, someplace no one else could reach it. He did not yet know her name was Amara. He did not know that somewhere in a leather-bound ledger he had never seen, in ink 30 years old, there was a line item with her mother's name on it, and beneath it a payment, and beneath that the word closed. He would learn. By day, Amara translated contracts for a shipping firm that had no idea what she really did with the paperwork that crossed her desk. By night, she sang at a basement club called Indigo, 3 sets a week, Standards mostly, her voice low and unhurried in a way that made grown men put down their drinks and listen. Both jobs were real. Both jobs were also, in a sense she never spoke aloud, cover. What she actually did, what had eaten 6 years of her life the way fire eats a house, room by room, was track the movement of stolen things. Bronzes lifted from a museum in Benin City that never made it back after a restoration loan. A queen's ceremonial ring, catalogued once in 1974 and never seen again. A shipment of Yoruba masks that had left Lagos on a manifest listing them as decorative furniture and arrived nowhere on record at all. Her parents had spent their lives trying to stop exactly this. Her father had been a customs investigator. Her mother had run a small cultural heritage trust that punched far above its budget. 6 years ago, the cargo ship they'd both boarded to intercept a shipment off the coast of Lagos had gone up in an explosion investigators called mechanical failure, and Amara had never, for one single day, believed. She had come to Seoul because a name kept surfacing in her mother's last files, a shipping conglomerate with Korean registry, moving through ports with suspicious ease, insured by a firm no one could quite find on paper. She had spent 6 years working her way toward the center of that name, like water finding a crack in stone. She did not yet know the name belonged to the man in the tinted car. The second time their paths crossed, it was in a police station that smelled like instant coffee and old paper, 3 days after the parking garage. A detective had decided that a Nigerian woman who wouldn't apologize for defending herself was easier to charge than 3 Korean men who could afford lawyers, and he'd slapped a folder of manufactured paperwork onto his desk with the particular satisfaction of a man who thought he was teaching someone their place. "You people," he said, not looking up, "come here and think the country owes you something." "It owes me an answer," Amara said. "Which of your officers wrote this report, and did they actually witness anything, or did somebody call ahead?" The detective's mouth opened to answer that with volume instead of substance. He never got the chance. "It owes her an apology," a voice said from the doorway, quiet in the particular way that makes a room louder just to compensate. Every officer in the station stood up at once, not out of courtesy, Amara understood immediately, but out of something closer to reflex, the kind of reaction bodies develop around men who have, at some point, decided what happens to people who make them wait. He was the man from the parking garage. She recognized him the way you recognize weather, a pressure change before you see the cloud. Dark suit, no tie, hair falling loose across a face that gave away exactly nothing until it chose to. He crossed the room and set a folder on the desk without looking at the detective at all. "She's under my protection," he said, effective immediately. "I'd hate for the department to discover it made an error it can't walk back." The detective's face did something complicated and then went the color of the folder. Nobody in that station needed his name explained to them. Amara watched grown men who'd looked comfortable threatening her 10 minutes ago suddenly find urgent business at their desks. Outside, in air that smelled like rain about to happen, she rounded on him with her arms crossed. "I never asked you to save me." "I know." He didn't seem bothered by that. If anything, something in his face eased, like he'd expected exactly this and had wanted it anyway. "So stop acting like you own this city." "I don't own the city," he said. "I own the people who think they do. There's a difference if you look closely enough." "That's not better." "No," he agreed. "It's honest, though." She studied him, really studied him, the way she studied a shipping manifest for the line that didn't add up. Whatever she'd expected from a man who could empty a police station with one sentence, it wasn't this. The faint, unguarded curiosity in his face, like she was the first unpredictable thing he'd encountered in longer than he could say. "Do-yun," he said, when the silence had gone on a beat too long. "Kang Do-yun." She knew the surname. It landed in her chest like a stone dropped down a well. She heard it hit bottom a full second after he'd said it, in a place she hadn't opened in years. Kang, the name that kept surfacing in her mother's files, tangled in shell companies and shipping registries like a root system under a house. She did not let any of that show on her face. She had spent 6 years learning not to. "Amara," she said, and offered nothing else and watched him understand, correctly, that this was a door only barely open, and that if he pushed it, he'd lose whatever chance he had of her opening it further herself. For the first time in longer than he could remember, Do-yun laughed, not the practiced half-smile he gave cameras and rival bosses, but something involuntary and slightly startled, like he'd surprised himself. Neither of them noticed the man across the street with a telephoto lens who took 11 photographs in 90 seconds and was on a secure line to Brussels before they'd even reached the corner. In a paneled room above a private bank in Brussels, an old man studied a photograph on a tablet screen and felt something click into place that he had been waiting 15 years to hear. "So," he said in the unhurried voice of someone who had never once in his life needed to raise it, "she found him." The younger man across the table frowned at the same image. Or he found her. Does it matter which? It matters enormously. The old man set the tablet down with the care of a man handling something explosive, which, in its way, he was. "It tells us who's driving." Around the table, 5 people who controlled, between them, more shipping tonnage than most nations, sat in a silence that had weight. On the table lay 2 photographs, a woman helping an old man to his feet, a man watching from a car window with an expression none of them had ever seen on him before. And one word, unspoken, that all of them understood: threat. "The Chukwu girl has been circling us for 6 years, someone said. "Ports, shell registries, insurance filings. She's careful, she's good. If she's found her way to Kang's son, then she's closer to the ledger than we thought," the old man finished, "and he doesn't know what he's sitting on top of." "Do we warn him?" The old man's silence answered before his words did. "We don't warn Kang Do-yun anything," he said finally. "We remove the variable before it becomes a problem he has to choose a side on, understand? Both of them, quietly if it can be quiet. Otherwise—" He made a small gesture, the kind that had ended more lives than a shouted order ever could. "Otherwise, however it needs to happen." No one at that table would have called it an order to kill 2 people. They would have called it risk management. That was, in its way, the most honest thing about all of them, that after 30 years, murder had simply become a line item, filed somewhere between shipping insurance and quarterly variance. The attempts began within the week, and each one taught Do-yun something about the woman he was rapidly, helplessly, coming to admire more than he had any right to. A car bomb, wired under the frame of the SUV she used for late-night runs to the club. She noticed the wiring because the mechanic who'd serviced it that morning had used the wrong brand of zip tie, and Amara Chukwu apparently knew every brand of zip ties sold at every hardware store within a mile of her apartment, because knowing small, useless things had kept her alive for 6 years, and she saw no reason to stop now. A sniper on a rooftop across from Indigo, positioned for a shot through the stage side window during her second set. She cut the set short by 4 songs because a pigeon that should have been roosting for the night instead scattered off that exact roofline at 9:40. And something about that, some small wrongness in the world, made the base of her skull go cold. Poison in a bottle of wine sent up to Do-yun's table at a restaurant with no return address on the card. Amara didn't drink that night, said nothing, simply watched the waiter's hands a beat too long and later, in the alley, extracted from him in under 4 minutes information that took Do-yun's security team 3 days to have confirmed independently. By the 4th failed attempt, Do-yun stopped being grateful and started being unsettled. "You're not lucky," he said one night in the back of the car, watching her check the street behind them in the wing mirror without seeming to move at all. "Luck doesn't clock zip tie brands." "I read a lot." "No," he said. "You were trained. Somewhere, by someone, for something specific. I've had men trained by the best security contractors money can hire, and none of them notice a rooftop the way you noticed that rooftop tonight." She was quiet long enough that he thought she wouldn't answer at all. "My father used to say," she said finally, "that the people who steal history count on nobody paying close enough attention to catch them. So he taught me to pay attention, to everything, all the time." Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "It cost him his life. It's the only inheritance I got to keep." "What happened to him?" "Ship explosion," she said. "Off Lagos, 6 years ago. Officially, mechanical failure." She looked at him then, and something in her eyes had gone very still, very careful, the way water goes still right before it freezes. Unofficially, my mother and father were 3 days from proving that a shipping network moving through half a dozen countries, Korea included, had spent a decade laundering stolen African heritage through art auctions and private collections. And then the ship they were on stopped existing. Duyun did not say anything for a long moment, because something cold had started moving through his chest, tracing a shape he didn't want to recognize yet. "What was the network called?" he asked, though he already knew, in the way you know a shape in the dark before your eyes adjust, that he wasn't going to like the answer. "They never gave it a name in the files," Amara said. "Just a symbol, a ledger mark. Looks like a seal, a dragon coiled around an anchor." Do-yoon's father wore that exact seal on a ring he had never once, in Do-yoon's whole life, taken off his hand. They ended up, 3 nights later, in the observation deck of an old astronomical tower on the edge of the city. Decommissioned, unheated, chosen precisely because nobody would think to look for either of them, somewhere so useless to hide in. Seoul spread out beneath the broken dome in a wash of light, indifferent to both of them. "My father didn't build what I run," Do-yoon said, into the cold and the dark before he'd fully decided to say it. "He took it. The man who actually founded it disappeared 30 years ago. Everyone assumes he's dead. I spent 4 years quietly trying to find out if that's true, because none of the story ever made sense to me, and my father has never once been a man who tells stories that don't serve him." Amara was very still. "I think I've been looking for the same hole in the story," she said, "from the other end." She reached up and unclasped a thin chain from around her neck, a necklace so plain it was almost invisible, a small brass shape hanging from it that Do-yoon almost mistook for decoration. "My mother gave me this the week before the ship," she said. "Told me it opened the truth. I thought it was sentiment. Grief talks in riddles." She held it out on her palm. It was, unmistakably, a key. Old, hand-cut, its bow worked into the shape of a coiled dragon. Do-yoon's blood went very quiet in his ears. His family kept in a vault beneath a decommissioned warehouse his father visited twice a year and spoke of to no one, a lock that matched exactly nothing in their current operation. An old hand-forged thing his father called sentiment whenever Do-yoon had asked and told him, every time, to leave alone. They looked at each other in the freezing dark and understood without either of them saying it that their lives had been quietly orbiting the same wound for years, before they ever stood in the same parking garage. "I know where the lock is," Do-yoon said. The warehouse stood on reclaimed land near the port, indistinguishable from 100 others, which was, Do-yoon understood now, exactly the point. Getting in required 3 of his father's old codes and 1 act of very deliberate betrayal, the kind Do-yoon had spent his whole adult life avoiding, and performed now without a single second thought. The key turned. The vault door came open on a room that smelled of rust and dust and something older than either. Paintings, stacked and shrouded in cloth that had gone the color of weak tea. A crate of uncut diamonds that neither of them touched. A gold funerary mask that made Amara's breath catch audibly in the dark, and a locked leather case that, when they finally forced it, held nothing so simple as treasure. It held a ledger, not a treasure map, a record. Names, dates, payments, transfers, shell accounts, funded militias, arranged deaths. 30 years of a partnership between governments who should have known better, corporations who never asked, European crime families with old names and older money, and a Korean network that had, page after careful page, made itself indispensable to all of them. Amara found the entry with her mother's name on it in under 4 minutes, because she had spent 6 years learning exactly what to look for. She read it once, silently, and did not make a sound. Do-yoon found the entry that mattered to him 2 pages later, and wished, immediately and completely, that he had not. Kang Tae-sung, it read, beside a payment authorization and a single Latin phrase that translated roughly to matter resolved. His father's signature, his father's hand, ordering, not approving, not permitting ordering, the deaths of 2 customs investigators who had refused to sell what they'd found. "He's alive," Do-yoon said very quietly, understanding the shape of it all at once, the way a photograph resolves out of static. "The man who built the network, the one everyone thinks is dead. Your father. My father." He said it like a confession, because it was one. He didn't inherit this. He built it and buried the body of the man he used to be, and let me spend my whole life believing I owed a dead legacy something. I don't. I owe a living man a reckoning. Amara closed the ledger with hands that were shaking, very slightly, for the first time since he'd known her. I need to tell you something, she said, and I need you to let me finish before you say anything at all. He waited. I didn't meet you by accident in that garage, she said. I'd been tracking your family's shipping registry for 4 months. I knew your route that night. I staged the confrontation with those 3 men. They were low-level enforcers I'd already identified, and I knew you'd be in that car, and I bet everything on the idea that you'd intervene, because I needed a way into your orbit that didn't look like an approach. Her voice didn't waver, which cost her something visible to hold. My plan was to get close enough to find the ledger, take it, and use it to bury your family's entire operation. I believed going in that you were exactly like your father. I was building a case against you in my head before I'd said a single real word to you. The silence that followed had a texture to it, thick and cold, like the air in the vault itself. And now, Do-Yun asked, now I know you fund 4 orphanages nobody's supposed to know about. I know you've paid off the medical debt of 11 trafficking survivors this year alone, personally, through an account with your own name nowhere on it. I know you have never once, in the 4 months I've watched your organization from the outside, touched a drug shipment or a trafficking route, and that you've quietly starved 3 networks that tried to run either through your ports. She looked at him, and for the first time since the parking garage, her composure genuinely cracked. I came here to destroy the wrong man, and somewhere in the last 3 weeks I stopped being able to remember why I was supposed to want to. Do-Yun said nothing. He turned and walked out of the vault into the dark of the warehouse, and did not look back, because for the first time in longer than he could remember, something had hurt him worse than any wound he'd ever taken in a fight, and he needed a minute where she couldn't watch him feel it. The syndicate did not wait for either of them to recover. They struck an hour before dawn, and they struck with everything. 3 teams converging on Do-Yun's headquarters from the port, the highway, and the rooftops, moving with the coordination of people who had planned this for exactly the kind of night when everyone's guard would be down. The first explosion took out the eastern gate. The second took the parking structure where, 12 nights earlier, Amara had dropped a man onto wet concrete and changed the entire shape of both their lives. Do-Yun's people fought back building by building, floor by floor, and the city outside mistook it, as it was meant to, for a war between rival gangs. Nobody in Seoul that night understood that what was actually collapsing, 1 floor at a time, was 30 years of buried history finally coming up for air. Amara found Do-Yun on the 4th floor, blood on his collar that wasn't his, directing what was left of his security team with a calm that only made the fear underneath it more visible if you knew where to look, and she did. "Where's your father?" she said. Not a question, a demand. "Rooftop," Do-Yun said. "He came himself. He wants to watch." They found Kang Tae-sung standing in the wreckage of what had been a helipad, unhurried, immaculate, a man who had staged his own death 15 years ago and had apparently spent the intervening decade enjoying the freedom of it. "My son," he said, and smiled the way men smile when they've already won and are simply waiting for everyone else to catch up. "You disappoint me. I built you an empire, and you spent it feeding orphans." "You killed her parents," Do-Yun said, in cold blood, for a ledger. "For a principle," his father corrected mildly. "They wouldn't sell. Business requires that everyone be willing to sell eventually, or the whole structure collapses. I explained this to your mother once, a long time ago, and she didn't understand either, and look what happened to her." He let that land, watched it land, and Do-Yun felt something in his chest go white and silent with rage. His father turned, unhurried, to Amara. "You," he said, almost fond, "have caused me more trouble in 3 weeks than my son has managed in 3 years, and I find I respect it enormously. So I'll offer you what I never offered him. Kill him. Take the ledger, the vault, everything you were owed and more, and walk away with the only revenge that will ever actually mean something. I'll even help you disappear afterward. It's the least I can do for your mother." He held out a pistol, grip first, across the wreckage, close enough that Amara could have taken 3 steps and had it in her hand. She looked at the gun. She looked at Do Yun, who had gone very still, watching her with an expression that had absolutely no fear in it at all, only a terrible, quiet trust, the kind that comes from a man who has decided, whatever else was true, that he would rather be wrong about her than right about everyone else. She took the gun. Kang Tae-sung's smile widened by exactly 1 degree. She turned and shot him instead. The old man went down slowly, almost gracefully, a hand pressed to the ruin of his chest, and even as the light left his eyes, he was laughing. A short, real, astonished sound, the laugh of a man encountering, at the very end, the one outcome his decades of careful calculation had never once accounted for. "You really are your mother's son," he said to Do Yun, and meant it, apparently, as the highest compliment he had left to give. And then he was gone. 8. What was left of the syndicate scattered in the hour after, taking with them a leather case they believed held 30 years of their own secrets. They were wrong. Amara had switched the ledger for a decoy 2 days earlier, in the 4 minutes it had taken Do-yun to argue with his own security chief about extraction routes, because 6 years of this work had taught her never to walk into a vault without a second plan folded into her sleeve. The real ledger had gone out, anonymously, encrypted, to 11 investigative journalists across 4 continents 48 hours before the attack. By the following week, Interpol coordinated raids across 12 countries. Politicians who had spent decades believing themselves untouchable discovered in the space of a single news cycle that they weren't. Billions in laundered assets were frozen. A network that had operated in the dark for 30 years came apart in the light in less time than it took most people to plan a wedding. Do-yun spent the following months doing something his father had told him, once would be the one unforgivable weakness a man in his position could show. He dismantled it. Not overnight and not cleanly. There were debts to settle, people to protect, a legitimate business to build out of the wreckage of an illegitimate one. But piece by piece, the shipping empire his father had built on stolen names became something else. A humanitarian logistics network, a repatriation fund, an organization whose sole public purpose was returning what 30 years of greed had taken and finding the families it belonged to. His former soldiers became investigators, protection details, translators. Men who had once broken kneecaps for a living learned, slowly and without much grace at first, how to guard a truck full of returning artifacts instead of a shipment of contraband. Amara went back to singing at Indigo 3 nights a week, and for the first time in 6 years, she noticed that the song sounded different in her own mouth, not like something she was using to hide inside, but like something she actually meant. He came to the club on a rainy Tuesday months later with no security detail, no tailored suit, no title that meant anything to anyone in the room. Just a man with a small wooden box, waiting at the back until her last set ended. "I can't erase what happened," he said when she finally came to find him, the applause for her final song still settling around them like dust. "I can't give your parents back 6 years, or a normal life, or the version of this that doesn't have a warehouse full of stolen history in it. I've thought about that a lot. There's nothing I can say that fixes it." "I know," she said. "But I can choose what happens next," he said, and opened the box. Inside, on a bed of dark velvet, sat a ring that had once belonged to a queen, recovered from the vault, authenticated, and according to the folded documentation beneath it, formally repatriated to the Chukwu family. No museum, no auction house, no institution standing between it and the hands it belonged to. "It's yours," he said. "It was always going to be yours. I just wanted to be the one who finally got it right." Amara looked at the ring and then at him, and felt something in her chest that she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could count. Not relief exactly, and not forgiveness, which was still its own long, unfinished work. Something closer to permission. "What future is this supposed to be?" she asked, exactly. "One where we stop running," he said, and reached for her hand. Not the box, not the ring, her hand, like it was the only thing in the room he'd actually come for. The lights had barely come back up around them when a courier stepped through the club's side door, soaked from the rain, and pressed a sealed black envelope into Do-Yun's free hand without a word. No return address, no explanation, gone before either of them could ask a question. Inside was a single photograph, a shadowed figure standing before another vault door, somewhere with unmistakably European architecture in the background. On the back, 6 words in careful, unhurried handwriting. The first ledger was only the beginning. Do-Yun looked at Amara. Amara looked at the photograph and then at him, and something passed between them that had nothing to do with fear at all. "Together then," she said. It wasn't a question. "Together," he said, and outside, the rain kept falling on a city that had no idea how much of its history was about to come home.